There is a tower on the north shore of Long Island that you can still see from a boat out on the Long Island Sound. 13 stories of brick rising above the trees, like something that does not belong on a quiet stretch of New York coastline. For decades, sailors used it as a landmark to navigate by. It is not a lighthouse, and it was never a hotel. It is Building 93, the tallest structure ever built inside an American psychiatric hospital, and it has stood empty, sealed, and slowly rotting for more than 30 years. As of this year, the state of New York has finally begun the paperwork to tear it down. Behind that tower sits the ruin of something almost nobody outside Long Island fully understands the scale of, or fully believes, until they see the footprint of it laid out on a map. At its peak, this was not simply a hospital. It was a self-contained town. It had its own power plant, generating its own electricity. It had its own farm, its own dairy herd, its own slaughterhouse, its own bakery, its own tailor shop, its own fire department, and its own stop on the Long Island Railroad, a private spur track that ran supplies and coal directly onto the grounds. It even had 2 of its own marinas along the waterfront. At its height, this one institution held more than 9,000 patients at once, a population larger than most of the incorporated towns around it, managed by a staff so large that locals said Kings Park was the only place in the country the Great Depression never seemed to reach, because the hospital simply kept hiring. This is the entire story of Kings Park Psychiatric Center, the asylum that grew so large it became its own city, and the tower at its center that the state sealed shut and, until very recently, could not decide what to do with, one way or the other. But before we walk through the gates, I want to ask you for one small thing. We work incredibly hard to bring you these deep-dive investigations into the forgotten institutions of America, the asylums, the prisons, the wards that history tried to bury. But looking at our analytics, the vast majority of you watching right now are not subscribed. It costs you nothing. It takes 2 seconds and 0 effort, but it helps us an enormous amount. It keeps this channel alive and lets us keep telling these stories the way they actually deserve to be told, from the records, and not the urban legend version. So if you want to support that work, take a second right now and hit the subscribe button. Thank you. Now, let's go back to where it started, with a farm, a ferry ride, and a county that had simply run out of room. To understand how a psychiatric hospital ended up with its own railroad station, you have to go back to Brooklyn in the 1880s, and to a single, overwhelming problem that the city of Brooklyn, then still its own independent municipality, could not solve inside its own borders. Brooklyn's asylum for the mentally ill, housed at Flatbush, was catastrophically overcrowded, and conditions inside it had become bad enough that state inspectors were beginning to take notice. The prevailing idea in American psychiatric care at the time, borrowed from a movement that had already reshaped hospitals across the country, was the farm colony model. Instead of concentrating patients inside a single dense urban building, the theory went, you move them out to open land, put them to work farming, and let fresh air, physical labor, and distance from the noise of the city do what medicine at the time could not. Work was considered treatment in itself. A patient hoeing a field or milking a cow was, by the thinking of the era, actively participating in his or her own recovery. In 1885, officials representing Kings County, the county that contains Brooklyn, purchased 873 acres of farmland and woodland on the north shore of Long Island, in a rural area then known as Indian Head, roughly 40 miles east of the city. The new institution opened under the name the Kings County Asylum, later renamed the Kings County Farm, and its first buildings were modest by design. Just 3 wooden cottages, built to house a total of 55 patients, deliberately kept small and scattered rather than concentrated into one large structure, an explicit rejection of the crowded, high-rise asylum model the planners considered inhumane. Within a few years, 16 cottages stood on the property, alongside a laundry, a heating plant, and a barn, housing around 450 patients who spent their days working the fields, tending livestock, and helping construct the very buildings that would house the next wave of arrivals. Picture what that daily labor actually looked like in the institution's earliest decades. Patients rose before dawn and were assigned to work crews based on physical ability rather than diagnosis, moving out into open fields that stretched toward the Long Island Sound, planting and harvesting vegetables that would feed the entire population that same season. Others worked the dairy barn, milking cows twice a day on a fixed schedule that did not pause for weather or illness. Others tended the piggery or helped construct the very cottages, then later the larger brick wards that would house the institution's growing population, meaning that a meaningful share of Kings Park's own physical campus was quite literally built by the hands of the people it was built to confine. The theory behind all of this labor, again, was not cynical on its face. Fresh air, physical exertion, and a sense of productive purpose were genuinely believed by the psychiatric establishment of the era to calm an agitated mind in ways that confinement alone could not. Whether the labor actually functioned as therapy, or whether it functioned primarily as a way to keep operating costs down on an institution the state was reluctant to fully fund, is a question that the surviving budget records suggest has more than one honest answer. The nearby rail station that served the growing institution had originally carried a different name, one connected to the neighboring Society of St. Johnland, a charitable community founded by an Episcopal minister named William Augustus Muhlenberg. Muhlenberg had established St. Johnland years before the asylum arrived, envisioning a self-sufficient religious and charitable colony on the same stretch of Long Island coastline, complete with its own workshops, its own housing for orphans and the elderly poor, and its own small industries, a utopian 19th century project built on almost exactly the same self-sufficiency ideal that the state would later scale up, secularize, and apply to psychiatric care immediately next door. When the Long Island Railroad used the St. Johnland name for its station without the Society's permission, a dispute followed, and the station was renamed Kings Park, after the asylum itself. The surrounding hamlet, which had been called Indian Head, eventually adopted the same name. The town of Kings Park, New York, that exists on a map today, quite literally took its name from the psychiatric hospital that built the railroad station the town grew up around. A naming dispute between a charity and a state asylum settled, in the end, entirely in the asylum's favor. There are not many places in America where you can say the local mental hospital is the reason the town has the name it does, but this is one of them. If you're already this deep into the story, you're clearly the kind of person this channel was made for. A like helps more people find it than you'd think. The farm colony's early idealism did not survive contact with its own success. By the 1890s, the very overcrowding the institution had been built to relieve had begun to reproduce itself on the new site. A state inspection in 1893 delivered a verdict that reads like an indictment. The buildings, inspectors wrote, were unsuitable and unhygienic. Facilities were inadequate, clothing was insufficient and of poor quality, and food was often unfit for human consumption. This was not a hospital struggling under the strain of unprecedented demand after decades of operation. This was a brand new institution, barely 8 years old, already failing the basic standards it had been founded specifically to correct. The report did not describe an institution that had drifted from its founding mission over time. It described one that had never fully lived up to it in the first place, a gap between the idealistic language used to justify the farm colony model and the underfunded, understaffed reality of actually running it that would define Kings Park for the rest of its existence. In 1895, amid mounting complaints about corruption and mismanagement, control of the asylum passed from Kings County directly to the state of New York, and the institution was renamed the Long Island State Hospital. It would go through several more names over the following decades, becoming Kings Park State Hospital in 1905, before finally settling on the name most people know it by, Kings Park Psychiatric Center, sometime in the mid-1970s. The repeated renaming across nearly a century is itself worth noticing, because it is a pattern this channel has traced at institution after institution. A state changing the letterhead on a struggling facility, updating the language, without necessarily updating the conditions the language was meant to describe. Whatever it was called on the state's letterhead in a given decade, the institution kept growing in exactly the same direction, outward, then eventually upward, absorbing more acreage, more buildings, more patients, faster than anyone in Albany seemed willing or able to plan for. By 1925, the campus had grown to more than 150 separate buildings scattered across the property. A small city, in the most literal sense, laid out along winding roads that connected patient wards, staff residences, workshops, and utility buildings in a sprawling, decentralized grid. The infrastructure the state built to keep this small city running is, on its own, a story worth telling in detail, because it explains exactly why locals eventually stopped thinking of Kings Park as merely a hospital and started thinking of it as its own self-contained world. The institution generated its own electricity from an on-site power plant, burning coal delivered directly to the grounds by that private rail spur off the Long Island Railroad main line. It ran its own waterworks and its own sewage system, entirely independent of the surrounding township's utilities. It operated a working farm with a full dairy herd, a piggery for raising hogs, a butcher shop to process the meat, and a bakery to supply bread for thousands of daily meals. It had its own tailor shop, producing and repairing the uniforms and clothing worn by patients and some staff. It had its own morgue, on site, to process the institution's own dead before burial in its own cemetery. It employed its own fire department. Staff, many of them, lived on the grounds in dedicated housing, raising their own families inside the boundary of the institution, so that children born to hospital employees might grow up, attend local schools, and never live anywhere but inside the shadow of the wards their parents worked in. The campus even maintained 2 separate marinas along its waterfront, one reserved for hospital use and another for the private recreation of staff and their families, a detail that captures just how completely the institution had folded ordinary civic and domestic life into its own boundaries. A hospital that runs its own power, water, food supply, marina, and railroad connection is not really a hospital in the way most people picture one. It is a municipality that happens to specialize in psychiatric confinement, and Kings Park, at its peak, functioned as exactly that. The patient population climbed relentlessly through the first half of the 20th century, tracking a pattern this channel has documented at institution after institution across the country. A facility built with a specific numerical ceiling in mind, overwhelmed within years, and then simply expanded again and again, rather than genuinely reformed. And as the population kept climbing, the state made a decision that directly contradicted the founding philosophy of the entire farm colony model. If the whole point of Kings Park had been to avoid the crowded, vertical asylum building in favor of small, scattered cottages, the state's answer to overcrowding by the late 1930s was to build the largest, most vertical structure the institution had ever seen. Construction began in the late 1930s on a 13-story tower, designed by state architect William E. Hoggard and funded through the Works Progress Administration, part of the same federal jobs program, building bridges, dams, and post offices across the entire country during the Great Depression. For a region of Long Island, where unemployment lines stretched down Main Street in towns up and down the North Shore, the hospital's steady, uninterrupted expansion made it something close to an economic anchor. One former ward attendant, reflecting decades later on just how insulated the institution felt from the economic collapse gripping the rest of the country. Put it in terms that are hard to improve on. If there was one place in the country that was not affected by the Great Depression, he said, Kings Park was it. The state kept funding beds, kept funding construction, and kept hiring, year after year, while banks failed and farms up and down the island went under around it. The building was designated simply by its number, Building 93, and it was completed in 1939, intended primarily as an infirmary and long-term care facility for the institution's elderly and chronically ill patients. It would go on to be described by more than one historian of Long Island's psychiatric institutions as the most famous asylum building on the entire island, and at its peak, it housed more than 1,200 patients inside a single structure, a population larger than many small American towns, stacked 13 stories high. Building 93 was, in a very real sense, the physical admission that the farm colony's founding ideal had failed. What had begun in 1885 as a deliberate rejection of the tall, dense asylum tower had, by 1939, become exactly that tower, just built later and built bigger than anything the original planners had imagined. After the Second World War, the patient population at Kings Park and every other Long Island state hospital surged even further, driven by returning veterans, an expanding state commitment to institutional care, and admission standards broad enough to sweep in far more than what any modern definition of severe mental illness would recognize. In 1954, the patient census at Kings Park reached its all-time peak, 9,303 people, held inside a complex that had, by then, swelled past 150 buildings. 9,000 people is not a hospital population. It is a small city's worth of human beings, confined at once, inside a single institutional boundary, on Long Island's North Shore. In the interest of getting the scale exactly right, rather than exaggerating it, Kings Park was not even the largest psychiatric institution on Long Island, let alone in the country. A short distance to the south, Pilgrim State Hospital, opened in 1931 with the transfer of its first 100 patients, grew even faster and further, reaching a peak census in that same year of 1954 of 13,875 patients, making it, at the time, the largest psychiatric facility of its kind anywhere in the world. Pilgrim maintained the same self-sufficient infrastructure Kings Park did, and then some. Its own waterworks, its own electric plant, its own police department, its own courts, its own church, its own post office, and its own cemetery. The two institutions sat close enough together that when Kings Park finally closed in 1996, its remaining patients were simply transferred down the road to Pilgrim, which continued operating. Kings Park's story is not the story of America's single largest asylum. It is the story of one of at least two such small cities, built within a few miles of each other on the same Long Island landscape, each holding a population in the thousands, each running its own power plant and its own farm, at the exact same moment in American history, a fact that says less about any one institution's excess and more about how completely this model of care had been normalized across an entire region. If you're finding this one worth your time, subscribing is the single biggest thing you can do to help this channel keep going. Who were the 9,000 people held inside those walls at any given moment? That is a question the popular telling of Kings Park's story tends to answer far too narrowly, because the institution's own admission records tell a story that goes well beyond severe, diagnosable mental illness. Former staff members interviewed decades later, and former patients themselves, describe an admissions net cast extraordinarily wide. People committed to Kings Park included the genuinely psychotic and severely mentally ill, yes, but also vagrants picked up off city streets with nowhere else to go, alcoholics, people with epilepsy, a condition still poorly understood and sometimes conflated with insanity, well into the 20th century, orphans, and runaway teenagers, with no other institution willing to take them, and immigrants, who, in the blunt language of one former ward attendant describing the population, one attendant, reflecting on the difficulty of understanding why so many people were actually inside the wards, put it plainly, it was hard to determine why they were here, but they were here. The asylum, like so many institutions this channel has documented, functioned less as a targeted medical facility and more as society's catch-all, the place every category of person judged inconvenient, unwanted, or simply unclassifiable elsewhere in the system eventually ended up. In the years just before the turn of the 20th century, as the original farm colony rapidly expanded beyond its founding scale, the institution added a reservoir, its own steam plant, and its own sewage system, infrastructure investments that predate even the earliest wave of major ward construction, and that reveal exactly how quickly Kings Park's administrators understood they were no longer building a modest rural retreat, but the beginnings of a full-scale, permanent municipal system. Every one of those systems would need to be scaled up again and again over the following half-century, chasing a patient population that never stopped arriving faster than the institution's planners ever seemed to expect. Daily life inside the wards, for the patients who actually needed psychiatric care and for the many who did not, followed a rigid institutional rhythm built around labor, medication, and, for large stretches of the 20th century, treatments that a modern reader will recognize immediately from other institutions this channel has covered, because the era's psychiatric establishment moved these treatments from hospital to hospital almost as a matter of professional fashion. By the time Kings Park's population reached its 1954 peak, the old rest and relaxation philosophy that had defined the farm colony's earliest decades had already been succeeded by a far more invasive set of techniques, prefrontal lobotomies, and electroshock therapy administered on a scale that reached deep into the general patient population, not merely its most severe cases. The lobotomy procedure performed at Kings Park, as at other institutions of this era, involved inserting a thin metal instrument through the patient's eye socket and into the skull cavity, then working the tool to sever the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain. The stated medical goal was to calm severe agitation, aggression, or psychosis that had proven resistant to every other available intervention. The actual well-documented result, in an enormous number of cases, was closer to erasure than treatment. Patients who survived the procedure often emerged permanently flattened in affect, stripped of the emotional range and complex thought that had defined them as individuals, described by more than one contemporary observer, in terms that amount to describing a living person reduced to something closer to a shell. Electroshock therapy, administered alongside and sometimes in place of lobotomy, rested on an observation from the treatment of epileptic patients. Doctors had noticed that some epileptics reported improved mood following a seizure, and reasoned that deliberately inducing a seizure, either through electrical current or through injected insulin, might replicate that effect in patients suffering from depression or other severe psychiatric symptoms. In practice, particularly before the introduction of muscle relaxants and modern anesthesia protocols, the convulsions triggered by electroshock treatment could be violent enough to fracture bones, and patients were strapped to treatment tables specifically because the seizures were powerful enough to throw an unrestrained body into dangerous, uncontrolled movement. The procedure could stretch on for up to 15 minutes per session, administered without the safeguards that govern its considerably more limited and carefully regulated modern medical use. Ward staff working these treatment sessions in the 1940s and 1950s often had no specialized psychiatric training whatsoever. Many were simply live-in workers, hired to keep some semblance of order across wards, holding far more patients than any reasonable staff-to-patient ratio would allow, thrown into administering or assisting with procedures that, decades later, some of those same staff members would describe to interviewers as among the most disturbing things they ever took part in. If you have watched this channel's other deep dives into institutions like Trans-Allegheny, Northampton, or Athens, you already know the dominant architectural philosophy that shaped American asylums through the second half of the 19th century. The Kirkbride Plan, named for the Philadelphia psychiatrist Thomas Story Kirkbride, a single enormous building with staggered wings stepping back from a central administrative core, designed so that every ward would receive direct sunlight and cross-ventilation. Kings Park represents something genuinely different, a rival school of institutional design that was gaining ground at almost exactly the same moment. The farm colony, or cottage plan model. Instead of one vast, centralized structure, the cottage plan scattered patients across dozens of smaller, freestanding buildings, arranged more like a village than a single hospital, with the explicit goal of avoiding the institutional density and dehumanizing scale that critics, even in the 1880s, had already begun to associate with the single-building Kirkbride asylums going up across the rest of the country. It is one of the sharper ironies in the entire history of American psychiatric architecture that Kings Park, founded specifically to avoid becoming another crowded, monolithic asylum tower, ended its architectural life by building exactly that, a single 13-story tower, taller and more densely packed with patients than almost any Kirkbride building this channel has ever covered. The cottage plan and the Kirkbride plan represented two different, competing answers to the same 19th century question of how to house the mentally ill humanely, at scale. And by the middle of the 20th century, under the same overwhelming pressure of population growth and chronic underfunding, both answers arrived, independently, at almost exactly the same failure. Not every patient who passed through Kings Park's wards was anonymous, and one of its most surprising commitments connects this quiet stretch of Long Island directly to Broadway and to Hollywood. John Buckmaster was an English stage and film actor, the son of the celebrated actress Dame Gladys Cooper, who had built a career on both sides of the Atlantic through the 1930s and 1940s. In February of 1952, only shortly after finishing a critically acclaimed Broadway run playing the Dauphin in George Bernard Shaw's St. Joan, Buckmaster suffered the most severe of a series of mental breakdowns that had troubled him for years. Accused of accosting women on a Manhattan street corner in the early morning and arrested carrying 2 knives, he was taken first to Bellevue Hospital for psychiatric evaluation, and from there, committed to the state hospital at Kings Park. His eventual release from the institution was secured through the direct personal intervention of 2 of the biggest names in 20th century theater and film, the actor Jack Merivale and the playwright and performer Noël Coward, both of whom had known Buckmaster through his mother's social and professional circles. Within roughly a year of his release, Buckmaster was well enough to travel to Hollywood and visit the actress Vivien Leigh on the set of the film Elephant Walk, a detail that captures, as sharply as anything in this story, just how wide a net institutions like Kings Park actually cast. A place built, in its official self-image, to care for the poorest and most forgotten people society had nowhere else to put also, at various points, held the son of a dame of the British Empire, whose freedom, when it came, arrived through a personal phone call from Noël Coward, rather than any formal review of his condition. One former patient's account of her time inside these wards has done more than perhaps any other single source to bring Kings Park's internal reality to a wider audience. Lucy Weiner was 17 years old on June 21, 1967, when she was committed to Kings Park's female violent ward following a series of suicide attempts. Weiner would go on to become a professional documentary filmmaker, and more than 30 years after her discharge, she returned to the by-then abandoned hospital to make a feature-length documentary about her own commitment and about the institution's broader legacy, released under the title Kings Park: Stories from an American Mental Institution. In the film, Weiner describes conditions inside the female violent ward in specific, unflinching detail. Patients were permitted exactly 1 shower per week, and the shower stalls themselves had no doors. She describes her time inside the hospital, in her own words, as terrifying and harrowing. She recalls the physical sensation of being medicated with Thorazine, the powerful antipsychotic that arrived in American psychiatric hospitals in the 1950s, as feeling, in her words, like wearing a lead suit, a chemical restraint that could, much like lobotomy before it, reduce a volatile, distressed patient into something closer to a compliant shell, simply through pharmacology rather than surgery. Weiner's film also follows her back out onto the hospital grounds, to an overgrown, largely unmarked area of the property that had served, for much of the institution's history, as its own burial ground. A potter's field where patients who died inside the hospital, and whose families either could not be located or would not claim them, were buried, frequently without a name attached to the grave at all. To this day, the New York State Office of Mental Health has never released a complete, public list of the patients interred there. Descendants searching for relatives who died at Kings Park, seeking nothing more than to know where a grandmother or great-uncle is actually buried, have spent years working through clerks' offices and health information units, simply trying to obtain a death certificate, let alone a grave location, for a family member the state absorbed and, in the most literal physical sense, never fully accounted for again. The scale and the decay of the abandoned campus turned Kings Park into one of the most extensively photographed and documented ruins in the entire urban exploration community, a subculture of photographers and explorers who specialize in entering and recording abandoned institutional buildings before they disappear. Entire websites have been built around nothing but Kings Park's decline, with names like Opacity and Designed Breakdown, hosting thousands of photographs taken across multiple visits over multiple decades, tracking the same buildings as their roofs failed, their floors buckled, and their walls slowly gave way to weather and vandalism. That level of documentation, ironically, has done more to preserve the visual memory of Kings Park's interior spaces than the New York State Office of Mental Health itself ever did through any official archive, because the explorers kept returning with cameras long after the state had simply locked the gates and walked away. The burial ground that Lucy Weiner's documentary returns to is formally known as a potter's field, the term used across American history for a burial ground reserved for the unclaimed, the indigent, and the unidentified. Descendants researching family members who died at Kings Park describe a process that can stretch on for years: written requests to the Suffolk County Clerk's Office, correspondence with the Health Information Management Unit at Pilgrim Psychiatric Center, which now holds many of Kings Park's surviving medical and death records, and navigation of a specific section of New York's mental hygiene law that governs how and whether those records can be released to the public at all. Even a successful search frequently ends only with a death certificate, confirming that a person died at the institution on a given date, without ever producing a specific, marked grave location. As of recent inquiries made directly to state officials, the complete list of names of everyone buried in that potter's field has still not been released. One name connected to Kings Park deserves a direct correction of its own, because it is exactly the kind of detail that tends to get inflated the further it travels from the historical record. Dr. David J. Impastato served for years as a consulting neuropsychiatrist at Kings Park, one of several institutions across the New York City area, where he held an appointment over a long and genuinely significant career. Impastato is a real, documented pioneer in the history of American psychiatry. On January 7, 1940, he administered what is credited as the first electroconvulsive therapy treatment performed in the United States on a schizophrenic patient, using a device brought to New York by a colleague who had studied the original technique developed in Rome. That detail is sometimes repeated online, as though the historic first American use of electroshock therapy took place inside Kings Park itself. It did not. The documented location of that first American ECT treatment was Columbus Hospital in Manhattan, where Impastato held a separate appointment years before his consulting work at Kings Park began. The distinction matters for the same reason. This channel corrects similar misattributions at every institution it covers. Impastato's connection to Kings Park is real, and electroshock therapy was administered at Kings Park extensively, and often brutally, as it was administered at asylums across the entire country. But the specific historic first, the single most citable fact attached to his name, belongs to a different building, in a different borough, and folding it into Kings Park's own story quietly overstates a connection that was already significant enough without the exaggeration. If this story is landing the way it landed on us while researching it, take a second to subscribe. We go this deep on a different forgotten institution every week. The turn away from Kings Park's peak population began not with a policy reform or a court ruling, but with a chemical breakthrough that this channel has traced through institution after institution, because its effect on American psychiatric care was genuinely seismic and genuinely nationwide. Thorazine, introduced into widespread American clinical use in the mid-1950s, gave physicians for the first time a pharmaceutical tool capable of managing the acute symptoms of psychosis without surgery and without the kind of prolonged physical restraint that had defined institutional psychiatry for a century. Nationally, the population held inside American state and county psychiatric hospitals peaked at roughly 558,000 people in 1955, and within 3 decades had fallen by more than 90%, one of the fastest, largest transformations of any category of institutional confinement in American history. Combined with a broader national shift toward deinstitutionalization, driven by advocacy groups, court rulings establishing patients' rights to treatment in the least restrictive setting available, and a growing public conviction that warehousing the mentally ill inside sprawling state institutions represented a moral failure rather than sound medicine, Kings Park's population began a steady, then accelerating, decline from its 1954 peak of 9,303 patients. By the early 1970s, that number had already been cut by more than half. By the early 1990s, the once teeming campus held only a few hundred remaining patients, rattling around inside a physical plant, originally built and staffed to manage a population 20 or 30 times that size. The physical shrinkage of the institution followed the same pattern this channel has documented at Northampton, at Trans-Allegheny, and at Athens. Not a single dramatic closure, but a slow, uneven retreat, ward by ward and floor by floor, over more than 2 decades. Building 93 itself became a visible symbol of that retreat. Beginning in the 1970s, the tower's upper floors began closing one after another. The geriatric and long-term patients who had once filled all 13 stories consolidated onto fewer and fewer levels as the broader population declined. By the early 1990s, only the building's first 4 floors remained in active use. 9 full stories of the tallest structure on the property, sitting completely empty above a shrinking population still living in the floors below. Building 93 closed entirely in 1992. Its utilities, the power and water that had kept even its remaining occupied floors functioning, were formally shut off in 1993, 3 years before the rest of the hospital followed it into closure. By the early 1990s, the New York State Office of Mental Health had developed a formal plan to close Kings Park Psychiatric Center outright, along with a sister institution on Long Island, Central Islip Psychiatric Center. The last remaining patients were transferred to the still operating Pilgrim Psychiatric Center in Brentwood, or discharged into community-based care programs that, as this channel has documented at institution after institution, were never built out in anywhere near the numbers that genuine deinstitutionalization would have required. The hospital's own last executive director would later describe the broader national policy of deinstitutionalization, in blunt terms, as a failed policy, not because closing institutions like Kings Park was wrong in principle, but because it was carried out too hastily, without the community infrastructure in place, to actually catch the population being released. Some former patients transitioned successfully into group homes and outpatient treatment, going on to live independent lives that would have been impossible inside the wards this video has described. Others ended up homeless, or cycling through the same jails and emergency rooms this channel has traced at every deinstitutionalized asylum it has covered. The same revolving door, the same unmet promise, a pattern national mental health researchers would later describe not as true community reintegration, but as trans-institutionalization, the simple relocation of the same population from one kind of confinement to another, less visible one. In November of 1996, the last patients still remaining at Kings Park were transferred out, and the state formally closed the institution, ending 111 consecutive years of operation on the same stretch of Long Island coastline where it had begun as 3 modest wooden cottages. The closure rippled through the surrounding community in ways that went well beyond the fate of the patients themselves. For more than a century, the hospital had been one of the largest employers in this part of Suffolk County, at various points rivaling the size of the local township's entire population, when its own staff and their families were counted alongside the patients. Nurses, ward attendants, groundskeepers, farmhands, tradesmen, and administrators who had spent entire careers, sometimes multiple generations of the same family, working inside those gates, suddenly found the institution that had anchored the local economy gone, its jobs gone with it, its buildings left standing empty behind a fence rather than torn down or repurposed with anything like the speed the local community had hoped for. The individual buildings that made up this small city each carried their own number and, among staff and patients, their own informal name, a naming convention that gives some sense of just how large and how specialized the campus eventually became. There was the Quad, 3 connected buildings shaped together into a rough X, completed in the early 1930s, specifically to house geriatric patients. There was Wisteria House, a maximum security ward for the institution's most violent patients, built in 1939, the same year as Building 93 itself. There were Buildings 21 and 22, twin 4-story structures, completed in the 1960s, one used for general patient housing and the other for hospital admissions, connected to a 10-story medical and surgical building, Building 7, by above-ground tunnels, with a rooftop water tower on Building 7, doing double duty as a radio antenna platform for the local fire department and public safety agencies long after the hospital itself had shrunk around it. By the early 1990s, virtually the entire remaining hospital operation had consolidated into just these 3 buildings, Building 7, 21, and 22, a hospital that had once sprawled across more than 150 separate structures, reduced to a tight cluster of 3, everything else standing empty, waiting. Even in its abandoned state, the campus continued to attract exactly the kind of attention that its own decay seemed to invite. In 1995, shortly after one of its buildings had been shut down, a low-budget horror film titled Eyes Beyond Seeing was shot inside Kings Park's Building 136, the hospital's former medical and surgical unit, with additional exterior shots of Building 93 spliced in to convince audiences that the film's interior scenes had been shot inside the tower itself, even though they had not. The film starred an actor playing a mental patient who believed himself to be Jesus Christ, and featured, in his final screen appearance before his death, the comedian Henny Youngman, cast as a mental patient who believed himself to be Henny Youngman, a small, strange footnote in a building whose real history needed no embellishment at all. The abandoned campus has also generated its own homegrown ghost story, one that deserves the same treatment this channel gives to every inflated legend it encounters. Acknowledge that it exists, and then be honest about where the documented record actually ends. A 2009 independent horror film, Blood Night, The Legend of Mary Hatchet, built its entire premise around a supposed local legend involving a patient committed to Kings Park who, in the story, went on a killing spree and became a folkloric bogeyman, haunting the area decades later. It is, by every available account, an invented legend, created for the screen, rather than a documented incident drawn from the hospital's actual patient or incident records. There is no verified historical Mary Hatchet in Kings Park's admission logs, no documented killing spree matching the film's premise, nothing beyond the film itself and the internet folklore that grew up around it after release. It is worth contrasting that invented story directly against everything this video has already covered that did happen and is documented. The 1893 inspection report, the lobotomies, the unmodified electroshock, John Buckmaster's real commitment and real rescue by Noël Coward, the unmarked graves in the Potter's Field that the state still will not fully account for. The manufactured ghost story is, in the end, less disturbing than the paperwork. If we've earned it, a like helps more people find these deep dives than you'd think. It is worth pausing on how differently this story has ended compared to some of the other institutions this channel has covered. A handful of former Kirkbride asylums elsewhere in the country found second lives as museums, as college campuses, as boutique hotels, their original architecture preserved and repurposed rather than demolished. Kings Park's own farmland became a public park relatively quickly and relatively successfully, and remains one of the more genuinely pleasant outcomes this channel has documented for any former asylums surrounding grounds. But the institution's single most iconic structure, the one building that actually made Kings Park recognizable to anyone who had never set foot on Long Island, appears headed for neither outcome. It will not become a hotel. It will not become a museum. It is, by the state's own current planning documents, simply too far gone, too contaminated, too structurally compromised after 30 years of total neglect to be saved in any meaningful sense. And the state's own preferred path forward is now demolition rather than adaptive reuse. Whatever version of Kings Park survives into the next decade, the tower most people picture when they hear the name will most likely not be part of it. What happens to 150 abandoned institutional buildings, scattered across 500 acres of prime Long Island waterfront, is its own story, and it is one that has stretched on for nearly 30 years without a clean resolution. In the years immediately following closure, the property sat largely unsecured, and the buildings deteriorated at a pace that alarmed even preservationists who had expected significant decay. Copper wiring and plumbing fixtures were stripped and sold for scrap. Vandals broke windows and covered interior walls with graffiti. Roofs failed, and water intrusion accelerated structural decay throughout the complex. By 2000, 4 years after closure, the state had converted the bulk of the property into the Nisquoga River State Park, a 522-acre public space now offering hiking and biking trails, birdwatching, kayak and canoe launches onto the Nisquoga River, athletic fields, and a designation as an official bird conservation area. The old private railroad spur that had once carried coal and supplies directly onto the hospital grounds was itself converted, in 2003, into a section of public hike and bike trail, a quiet, almost poetic transformation of the very infrastructure that had once made the institution self-sufficient into a recreational amenity for the community that grew up around it. But the park's public-facing recreational areas exist alongside a very different reality, a scattered ruin of institutional buildings that the state has never fully resolved what to do with. Community advocates organized under the banner of the Nisquoga River State Park Foundation, established in 2008, pushing for years to secure funding, just to begin addressing the property's most dangerous structures. That funding finally arrived in 2011, when the state released $14 million for the first phase of cleanup, a phase that called for the demolition of 19 separate buildings and their connecting underground tunnels. A single funding round, wiping out more structures than most entire hospital campuses this channel has covered, ever contained in total. In 2007, a historic resource survey determined that the former hospital campus was eligible for listing as a large historic district on the National Register of Historic Places, a designation that would have protected the site's collective architectural and historical significance as a unified whole. That eligibility did not survive the following decade, as the state continued demolishing individual buildings across the property, removing structures deemed too deteriorated or too dangerous to preserve. A subsequent survey concluded that the property had lost the architectural cohesion required for large district eligibility. Piece by piece, the demolitions themselves had erased the very historical integrity that might once have protected the site as a whole. Of the roughly 150 structures that once stood on this property, only 16 buildings today retain individual eligibility for the National Register, including Building 93 itself, and a cluster of 14 buildings that once made up the hospital's Veterans Memorial Unit. By 2023, preservation advocates were forced to designate the remaining Kings Park buildings, including Building 93, as one of Long Island's most endangered historic places, warning that continued neglect, mold, asbestos contamination, and the state's own gradual demolition program were actively erasing a site of genuine national significance in the history of American psychiatric care. And Building 93 itself, the tower that gave this institution its most recognizable silhouette, the structure sailors on the Long Island Sound once used as a landmark, has sat completely sealed and empty since its utilities were shut off in 1993. State park officials describe the building today in the blunt language of a liability rather than a landmark. Asbestos-containing materials, lead-based paint, and PCB-containing light fixtures throughout the structure, floors that have already collapsed in places, open elevator shafts dropping through all 13 stories, and a real, documented risk of structural collapse that has led park police to actively patrol the grounds, particularly around Halloween, when the building's reputation draws exactly the kind of urban explorers and thrill seekers the state most wants to keep out. Despite fencing, boarded windows, and regular staff patrols, unauthorized entry into the tower has never fully stopped, and park officials have described falling debris, the risk of sudden structural collapse, and fire hazard as ongoing, unresolved dangers to the public, to park staff, and to any emergency responder who might have to go in after a trespasser who does not come back out on their own. One park police officer, describing the annual surge in trespassing attempts, put the danger plainly. Inside the building, he said, you have asbestos, you have deterioration, floors that have collapsed, open elevator shafts, and it is simply unsafe. The building that once held 1,200 patients at once, the tallest structure ever raised inside an American psychiatric hospital, now exists primarily as a hazard that the state patrols to keep people out of. Rather than a landmark, it is found any way to preserve, restore, or meaningfully interpret for the public. That standoff appears, finally, to be ending, not through preservation, but through demolition. The master plan governing the future of Nisquoga River State Park has formally selected the demolition of Building 93 as its preferred outcome, and as recently as this year, the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation has begun formally soliciting engineering and architectural firms to conduct the environmental assessment, hazardous materials abatement planning, and structural evaluation required before the tower can legally come down. The scope of work now moving through the state procurement process reads like an inventory of everything 30 years of abandonment has left behind. a supplemental environmental site assessment, a full hazardous materials survey covering asbestos, lead, PCBs, and universal waste, a structural integrity assessment not just of the tower itself, but of its connected underground tunnels, and a formal plan for interpreting the site's history for the public before that history is physically removed. The building's own tunnels, the underground network that once connected it to the rest of the hospital complex, exactly as similar tunnel systems connected the wards at Trans-Allegheny and at Sing Sing's death house, will need to be assessed and sealed or removed as well. The state's own request for proposals acknowledges directly that if the structure proves too dangerous for workers to safely enter and abate in the conventional way, an alternate demolition approach will need to be devised, an admission that after 3 decades of neglect, the building may now be too far gone for anyone to even walk through it safely one final time before it disappears. If the current planning process runs its course, the 13-story tower that has loomed over this stretch of Long Island Sound since 1939, that held more than 1,000 of the institution's most vulnerable patients at its peak, and that has stood empty and sealed for longer than most of its patients ever lived inside it, will not be restored, and it will not become a museum or a hotel the way a handful of other former Kirkbride-era institutions eventually did. It will simply be taken down, board by board and floor by floor, its hazardous materials abated and hauled away, until the landmark that once guided boats home across the Sound is gone entirely. There is a small museum on the grounds today, the Kings Park Heritage Museum, run by local historical volunteers rather than the state, housed in one of the surviving smaller structures on the property, and staffed largely by former hospital employees and their families, people who remember the institution not from a photograph or a documentary, but from decades spent actually working inside it. The museum's collection exists almost entirely because ordinary people who once punched a time clock on these grounds decided, on their own initiative and largely at their own expense, that the story deserved to be kept somewhere better than a locked state archive. The museum preserves photographs, patient artifacts, staff uniforms, and oral histories from former staff and patients, before that history disappears, along with the buildings that housed it, an entirely volunteer-driven effort to hold on to a record the state itself has shown little appetite for maintaining. Lucy Weiner's documentary remains, for now, the fullest public record of what daily life actually felt like behind those walls, a record built entirely from the memory of the people who lived it, because the institution itself, in its own official capacity, has released remarkably little and continues, through New York's own mental hygiene privacy statutes, to keep entire categories of its own historical record legally sealed decades after the last patient walked out the door. Kings Park Psychiatric Center is not, in the end, a story about a haunted building, whatever the reputation that has attached itself to Building 93's silhouette over 3 decades of abandonment, and whatever a low-budget horror film invented to cash in on that reputation. It is a story that, once you know it, changes the way you look at that tower the next time you happen to see it from a boat out on the Sound. It is the story of what happens when a society decides that the correct response to human suffering, human poverty, human difference, and human illness is to build a self-contained city large enough to make 9,000 people disappear from public view at once, and to keep that city running for 111 years before finally admitting that warehousing was never the same thing as treatment. The farm colony model that founded this place in 1885 was, in its own era, a genuine reform, a real rejection of the chained, windowless asylum cells that had defined institutional psychiatry for the century before it, an idea built with real conviction by people who genuinely believed that open fields and honest labor could do what locked wards and restraints never had. And within 70 years, that same reform had produced its own tower, its own overcrowding, its own lobotomies, and its own unmarked graves, following almost exactly the arc this channel has traced at Northampton, at Trans-Allegheny, and at every Kirkbride-era asylum, built on the same founding promise: idealism, expansion, overcrowding, custodial neglect, closure, and finally, decades of quiet decay, while the state decides, building by building, what to demolish and what to simply let fall down on its own. The tower is coming down. The farm fields are a state park now, walked by joggers, bird watchers, and families launching kayaks onto the Nissaquaga River, most of whom mostly do not know, and are not told, what the ground beneath their feet once was, or that the quiet trail they are biking along used to carry coal trains directly onto hospital grounds. The Potter's Field, where the unclaimed dead were buried, still has no public list of names attached to it, more than a century after the first of those graves was dug. And somewhere in the paperwork moving through Albany right now, engineers are drawing up the final plans to remove, floor by floor, the one structure that anyone driving along the north shore of Long Island, or sailing past on the Sound, can still look up and actually see, the last visible piece of a small city that once held more people than most of the towns around it, and that the state built, filled, and then quietly, gradually, tried to make disappear, the way it has tried to make so many of the people who once lived inside it disappear too. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, you already know exactly what this channel is about and what it truly stands for. Subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. We cover a different forgotten institution every week, and every single one of them has a story the rest of the internet has, at some point, simply forgotten to tell properly. We'll see you inside, wherever the next tower we cover turns out to be standing.